Okay, good evening, Energy Rogue Nation. Welcome back to another weather discussion. Thank you all so much for tuning in. In tonight's video, we're going to be talking about the latest with the tropics, but also focusing in on some temperature trends. We have been long overdue as it relates to the winter forecast update. Has our forecast changed for the next couple of months, or does it look the same for the rest of October and November? We'll be talking about that here in tonight's video. But first, a little bit of a diatribe here, because Cash, you inspired me to look into this a little bit more. For those of you that are wondering about context, Cash had asked a question earlier today as it relates to AccuWeather, because as many of you know, AccuWeather is a private company that provides weather forecasts for pretty much everywhere in the United States. In terms of temperatures, in terms of winter weather, hurricanes, etc., they've been around for eons. I think going all the way back to at least the 1960s, but of course not becoming mainstream until right around the 2000s-ish. So I am never one to criticize nor bash another company. But if there was one that I severely despise and that the entire weather community despises, it is AccuWeather. And if you ever want to hear my full diatribe about that, I'm happy to do that on a separate call or maybe a video. But what it boils down to for me, there's a multitude of reasons why I don't like AccuWeather, really outside the scope of what I'm about to talk about. But one of the things that they do is they provide temperature forecasts way in advance. I mean, I've even seen in some cases they're providing temperature forecasts for specific areas in the month of December. So, Cash, you inspired me to provide you with this. It's not necessarily what I was looking to provide, but I think it still gets the point across. So this is just an example of the different weather models. So this is the INCEP, which is a NOAA-based product, as well as I believe it's also technically a web service, but also a model. We then have the ECMWF plotted in red, yellow is the average, and gray is the various runs. All of these days, so this is the 25th, the 26th, the 27th of May. I don't know what year this was taken, but I think regardless, this is still relevant. It gets the point across. So if we were to look at this chart, notice how our ECMWF in red, our blue INCEP, and the yellow is the average between those two. They trace pretty well. I mean, you could draw a really good trend line here. And let me go ahead and just make this easier and draw it in black. You can draw a trend line, but it pretty much follows this pretty good. And so keep in mind the days. This is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. It traces still pretty well. And then by the time you get to even about the 7th day, notice how your gray runs, now they're all over the place, right? You have a really large, massive distribution outside of those 5 to 7 days. And so rule of thumb, and what this really proves quantitatively, is that rule of thumb says in meteorology, for us to truly nail down temperature, we really have a better idea within that, say, from day 1 to day 7 days out from a forecast. Once we get beyond that point, when we start to talk about, in this case, this would be the first, the second, so this is the next month, so this would be like that week 2 time frame. Look at how all these different model runs, you got one up here, one down here, and they're all sort of just clustered all over the place. You get more of a spread and a variation. That's because there's a lot of uncertainty outside of that. And the reason for that uncertainty is you got to remember, these weather models, beyond a certain time step, are making a lot more assumptions about what could happen versus in the near term. They're assuming things like low pressure systems that have yet to form, or if low pressures have formed in the Pacific, them, sweeping all the way down to the Gulf. You get my point. All these different hypothetical scenarios that the model has to sift through without enough raw observational data. It goes back to the same conversation we had when we were tracking Milton, in that for models to truly correct and for models to truly be effective, and more effective than they are without raw data, they need to have that raw data. They need to have observational data, what we call in situ data, So that way those models can correct and be more cognizant of what the present environment looks like, as opposed to making assumptions. That's why those reconnaissance missions we talk about for hurricanes are hugely important, because they collect a crap ton of data that a buoy and even a passerby cargo ship can't collect and get the full scope of. So hopefully this chart makes a lot of sense. And for all of you here that really do follow the weather, which is pretty much everybody here, I mean, this is pretty intuitive. A lot of you are already familiar with this concept, but I wanted to go a little bit under the hood here, so to speak, and show you why we don't typically forecast out temperatures that far out, or it gets uncertain. We do, but it's a little bit more uncertain. So that is a great segue to wxrogue.com, and many of you have checked it out, and thank you so much for your feedback thus far. Remember, we are extending the survey till the 20th, so I will reopen that. I'll post it in the Discord. I would love to hear from more of you, so if you haven't had the opportunity to fill in that feedback form as it relates to WX Rogue, it only takes you about 5 minutes of your time. And listen, I know you already have or are going to fill out the form for the newsletter for Energy Rogue. If you haven't filled that out yet, please do so. Feedback is truly important to Brian and Bill. Feedback is also very important to me. So if you could fill out both, knock out 2 birds with 1 stone, fill out that form, and then come on back and fill out this form too as it relates to WX Rogue. We talked in the beginning of this video about model miss and model uncertainty. The same thing can happen here on WX Rogue, and we actually see that, right? So for example, if we were to scroll all the way down to our premium products, you notice that our forecast goes out from the 16th all the way out to the 28th. That's 12 days, right? So the important thing to bring home here is I'm not going to sit here and say that, well, our forecasting product is more accurate, right? Because there's no such thing as more accurate, in my opinion. It's just better data. What I will say, though, is that with WX Rogue, the one thing to keep in mind is that, of course, we are plotting for, in this case, population-weighted cooling degree days, so it is reflective of that. But also, there is uncertainty here past, say, the 22nd. So although we see a bit of a downtrend, let's say, for the mountain region, that's not to say that that won't change. So the important thing to note here is while we do plot out to the 28th, and that can be very helpful, bear in mind that the uncertainty does increase once you go out 7 days, right? So that's the important thing to note here. There's not a disclaimer on the website, but I think context matters and transparency matters, and I think that's something we want to mention here since we're on the topic of weather models and their pros and cons. But if we were to look at the weather models themselves, in particular the GFS, this, I think, really underscores the pattern that we're in. So again, maybe not so much so focused on the temperatures here. Don't get too tied up with that, especially towards the 28th. I think the biggest thing to drive home here is look at this population-weighted cooling degree day trend over time. So we see our cooling degree days here in the short term decrease, and you'll see why in a moment, but a lot of that has to do with low pressure that is going to be moving further south. So these low pressures that originate from the poles, they're going to be sweeping across much of the United States. That's going to sharply decrease your CDD and actually increase your heating degree days in reverse. But if you look towards the 22nd, later on in the week, you see a nice rebound back up towards some high CDDs. But then towards the end of the run, it decreases again. So what you're going to find in this video, and I think what's really important to underscore here on WX Rogue, is we are going to see a lot of volatility with our temperatures. It's the exact same thing I talked about just a few days ago with you guys on that voice message. That forecast has not changed. And again, we're going to go through the why and the under the hood here in a moment. But the important thing to note is that as we go through October and November, a little bit of a spoiler here, we are expecting for much of the United States to be still either mild or above normal in temperatures, despite the fact that we are going to see a lot of this volatility with our heating and cooling degree days, at least over the next couple of weeks. This is very common. This is not something that's out of the ordinary. And as a matter of fact, because we are even transitioning, we're in the fall, we're going to be kind of working our way towards winter, but also at the same time, we are transitioning from an ENSO neutral, to a La Nina, which tends to favor more of those cold shots. So, this is all within reason. The output here makes a whole lot of sense. But of course, for you that are trading natural gas and energy, from the weather perspective at least, it is an absolute roller coaster ride. That's not even factoring in the geopolitical influences that Brian and Bill have been talking about on Energy Rogue. So while geopolitical has also been very kind of oscillating and very volatile, so has our weather. And that has made it a pretty rough navigation for those of you that do trade nat gas and energy. So, wanted to now take you under the hood as I promised, so we'll head on over here to COD. And I want to show you the pattern that we're in, because I really do believe that this does underscore the volatility. So, we have, I think what's clear off the page right away, is you have this massive low pressure system. And I would even call it a shortwave trough. So, essentially, trough is just a air mass of typically colder air, right? And this air mass, when we talk about troughing, it's usually associated with low pressure. So we do see that low, this upper level low out towards Maine, and you see this big swath of cold air. That is why, folks, we have a big portion of the Midwest and even up towards the upper Midwest tonight under hard freeze warnings. This is going to be our first freeze of the season for a lot of folks in the Great Lakes. Even in some parts of Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee could see some frost, possibly freezing depending on elevation. So, and also, let's not forget the Northeast and New England. We just mentioned WX Rogue, and we saw that huge drop in our CDD, large increase in HDD. That volatility in the immediate short term, aka the next 24 to 48 hours, is because of this bowling ball trough that's bringing down a ton of cold air from Canada. Now, meanwhile, out towards the Rockies, we have an area of high pressure, or what we call an upper level ridge, that's keeping conditions dry and also above normal in temperatures. And so, this leads us to what we can expect the rest of the week into early next week. This area of high pressure out towards the Rockies is eventually going to make its way towards the lower Great Lakes, the Midwest as a whole, and the upper Midwest. And as it does so, we're going to see that rapid change from below normal temperatures to above normal temperatures, aka CDD to HDD and back to CDD again. So let's take a look here at the GFS just to show you that point in action. And so here is that trough we were talking about at the top of the hour. That's going to continue to move through the east and central United States later on tonight into tomorrow morning. And watch this upper level ridge. This thing does not stay in place at all. Look at that. We go from Tuesday being below normal, especially Wednesday with that freeze, to look at that. Now all of a sudden, we have the Midwest and the eastern United States under that upper level ridge. That's going to bring in some of that warm air advection for those parts of the country. But then those areas that were under the ridge a few days ago will then be met with a trough or an area of low pressure, and that's going to bring temperatures down towards the Rockies, the Pacific Southwest, and the Pacific Northwest. Could, by the way, even see some snowfall accumulation out towards the Rockies. Yes, I said snowfall. We could see some snowfall in some of those higher elevations. Brian, I don't know your altitude, but depending on where you're at, may see some snow, especially by Telluride and I believe Breckenridge. If Breckenridge is in Colorado, it might be Wyoming. But you get the point. Four corner states are likely to see some snowfall out of this and also some of those cooler temperatures. And then if we're to play this out into the rest of this week, and this would actually take us into early next week, so the weekend early next week, you can see that then we once again deal with some precipitous conditions for the Midwest, but for the most part, rather mild, right? Mild temperatures and some cooler temperatures mainly for New England and possibly even up towards the Pacific Northwest by early to middle of next week, but otherwise relatively mild until we see another blast of low pressure move through, but this would be all the way out towards the 27th. I've already talked enough about how we should not forecast too far out, and we can forecast far out, but there's uncertainty. So it would be very sacrilegious of me to start diving into things that are 300 hours out. Now, with all that in mind, one other diatribe to the topic we talked about at the start of this video as it relates to weather models. Some of you are probably asking, well, Brendan, so what makes the climate models accurate? Like, if you're going to sit here and say that, I can only look at the 5 to 7 day window, well, then why do we go over the climate models and look at the month to month? The reason is because those models are different. Yes, I said different, in that they are taking into account not just the climatological normals, but also they're factoring in things like El Nino and La Nina and saying, okay, based on what we expect with La Nina and based on other historical episodes of La Nina, this is what the output looks like, right? So it's a different algorithm, and I'm really kind of scratching over the surface of that, and I'm being very elementary in how I explain that. But think of it as just a different algorithm. And also, because we're only forecasting for a couple of variables, because of that, we can forecast out farther. But with a model like the GFS, because we're forecasting all these different variables, we can't, be going out several months in advance because this algorithm doesn't allow for that, right? There has been some research on maybe extending this model out. It's called subseasonal to seasonal. I won't get into the granular on that, but for the time being, these models are only going out to 300 hours, and even then, a lot of uncertainty exists past that 5 to 7 day window. So, one last thing I wanted to mention is, before I forget, I wanted to show you the National Hurricane Center, because a lot of folks, I saw in the chat with the WX Rogue Discord, that a lot of people were talking about the system just to the east of the Lesser Antilles with a 50% chance of cyclone formation. Right now, at the moment, this system is not doing so hot, for one. So if we were to go take a look at it, here's Infest 94L. It clearly it's trying to get its act together, but it is facing what is probably a lot of shear without even looking at it. Because if you notice, look how unorganized it is. It's trying to get convection to fire off, some deep convection towards the center here, but clearly, you could probably make out a low pressure, but it's got a long way to go. And even still, I am very bearish on this system, only because I think that once it gets towards, and I'll back up here, once this gets towards, say, Cuba and the Dominican Republic, and as well as Haiti, it's going to be, for one, moving over a very rough terrain. Friction does not really let up for storms. It's essentially a kryptonite to these storms is friction with a lot of these mountains and so forth and rough terrain. But not just that, but you also have that progressive pattern we talked about in the United States, and that's going to bring wind shear down to this region. So while this may develop over time into some form of a tropical storm, I'm very bearish on its impacts towards the United States. I just don't think the environment's favorable right now. Now, if we were talking 5 days ago, I was actually looking at a system developing once again in the Gulf. That never happened. But I still think we are probably due for one more system in the Gulf, and two would be kind of the more, worst case scenario. But I definitely think one is in the cards, at least before the end of the season. So anyway, want to give you an update on that. We'll continue to monitor 94L. I am not very confident in its impacts. I think the environment in comparison to, say, Milton and Helene is much different in that it's going to be battling a ton of shear, and it's also going to be moving over pretty rough terrain before it even spits out the other side. So not very bullish on this system's development, but if anything changes, of course, we'll keep you posted. Listen, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, be sure to post those down in the Weather Rogue Discord channel, and we'll be back here with another weather video very soon. Take care.